Welcome to another 2-Minute Tuesday and welcome to another bland set. I can assure the audience out there, new location and soon to be a new set of sorts. If you haven't noticed already behind me, the English Basketball League ball, that's because today we are talking about a man who everyone in the UK should know about, Raptors head coach Nick Nurse. I want to talk about Nurse for several reasons. I've written a story on him that is yet to be published and I hope I can get it out there one of these days. But here's some of the things I've learned. There are a lot of things. Let's start with the fact that Nurse is an incredible athlete, not to mention one of the greatest basketball influences in this country. He was a four-sport athlete at Kimper Catholic High School in Iowa, where he grew up. We can start with the normal sports. He played quarterback in football, pitched and shortstop in baseball. He was also the point guard on the basketball team. Naturally, he's a head coach now in the NBA. His fourth sport, however, pole vaulting, and Nick Nurse still holds the record at the school for pole vaulting because shortly after he set the record, well, they banned it for safety reasons. In 1985, he won the team their first state championship in basketball. He also, the same year, the winter before that actually, qualified the team for the state football playoffs for the first time. That basketball state title is still the only one that Kimper have won to this day. Nick Nurse is a legend out there, and I've heard he's pretty good at golf as well. The fascinating thing about the Raptors, if you haven't got a team out there and you are from the UK, look at Toronto. Nick Nurse spent 11 seasons coaching in the UK. Derby, Birmingham, London, Manchester, Brighton. Go down the list. Alex McKechnie, the Director of Sports Science, was born in Glasgow and now works for the team. Masai Ujiri, the GM, played in the British Basketball League, more on that later. OG Anunoby, of course, is London born and he plays for the Raptors now. They have so much British influence, I'm not even sure they know fully about it. Phil Handy, one of the assistants on that team, played for Nick Nurse in Manchester in the early 2000s. He's of course famous for coaching LeBron James and Kawhi Leonard down the years. So how did Nick Nurse arrive in the UK back in 1990, nearly 30 years ago now? Well, Chris Squires and Bill Badley are the two names you need to know. Badley is a teacher and coach at Carroll High School in Iowa. He grew up knowing Nick Nurse, obviously he was a lot older than him, and he used to host camps in that state where Nick used to go and play. And Chris Squires, who works for Derby still to this day in various roles, they were both at the same time at a basketball tournament in Holland. I know, very random indeed. They started chatting, as all basketball lifers do, about the game. Anyway, Bill Badley went back home to Iowa, didn't think anything of it. He knew he'd stay in touch with Chris in some capacity. A few weeks later, he's getting ready for the school year to start, and Chris Squires gets in touch with him and says, "Look, Bill, we've got a vacancy at Derby, the head coaching role." Well, Bill Badley didn't really want to take his family over to England, but he did mention to Chris at the time, "I think I've got a name who you might be interested in, Nick Nurse, who was a great athlete, and he probably wants to get into coaching now." Well, Nurse was none the wiser. He had recently finished his university degree and playing career at Northern Iowa. He was a graduate assistant, as a lot of people that want to get into coaching do. They become grad assistants before learning how to scout and getting a better job, working themselves up the ladder. Well, Nick Nurse had just been offered a playing job in Brazil, so he wanted to get back into tip-top shape. Remember, he's only 20, 21 years of age. His playing career, at least to him, is not over at this point. So he's in amazing shape, and suddenly the offer in Brazil just disappears from the face of the earth. Well, Nick Nurse looks at himself and says, "Hey, I'm ready to play." So he starts sending out these information packages all over the world, Japan, Australia, and Derby. But the Derby Bucks didn't exactly take notice of it until Bill Badley said what he said to Chris Squires. Now, Chris Squires went back to the club and they rummaged through their information, and it says on the package from Nick Nurse that he'd sent without knowing any of these conversations had happened, "I'm happy to play and or coach for your team." So Derby get on the mobile blower, they call up Nick Nurse, and the rest, as they say, is history. Now, Nurse, being the competitor that he was and the athlete that he was and still is, I think, at least on the golf course, it's rumoured that in his first game with Derby, about 3 days off the plane from Iowa, he pulled down the shorts of Gene Waldron, who played for Syracuse and was now playing in the UK for Leicester. So the big Midlands Cup, derby against Leicester, just a friendly. Someone told me for this story, and I haven't quoted it because I don't believe it, that Nick Nurse was chased into the car park by Waldron because he was so angry that Nurse had pulled down his shorts. But that's the kind of competitor that he was or might have been if it were true. Nurse had to deal with things that he would not have to deal with in the NBA today. He was actually the PR department. In the NBA, you have staffs that look after that sort of thing. Nurse, 10 minutes before tip-off, even if he was a player coach as well, his teammates are going through layup drills and he's trying to talk to a sponsor or get more fans into the arena. Selling tickets was the main priority because, let's be honest, a roster with 7 or 8 players, not a lot of money in the club. Nick had to do multiple roles, and a lot of people say this is why he was so successful in the then Development League, now the G League, with the Iowa Energy and Rio Grande, because in the G League, you have to do so many things. You have to look over a roster that's turning over constantly, same in the BBL. Tim Lascelles, who used to play for the Bucks, told me that Nick Nurse, when he saw the state of the court at Moorway Sports Centre in Derby that's now been abolished and knocked down, he wasn't best pleased, and he used to go and pay 80p a couple of days a week to go and get his shots up at a local gym because the Bucks only had 2 official practices a week. And you think about what he had to deal with back then to where he is now, it's quite incredible. When he was with Brighton, he's the man responsible for bringing Dennis Rodman over, the former Chicago Bulls legend, to play a couple of games. He owned the team, he was the GM, he was the scout. And he is also the man who discovered, British basketball fans will know this name, Fabulous Flournoy, who still plays and coaches for the Newcastle Eagles. Nurse and a man by the name of Tim Rudge, who worked with Nick throughout his career in England. Well, Nick was back in the US between jobs in the UK, and he called up Tim and said, look, I've got a lot of guys here that I'm seeing that probably won't get noticed. I want to push them to the UK. So Nick comes back, he hires a minibus with Tim Rudge, and they drive these players around the country, getting them in front of BBL scouts. One of those guys is Mr. Flournoy himself, and he remains to this day in the UK. When Nurse was with the Birmingham Bullets in the mid-90s, his place of residence was actually a hotel, and he had a lot of time on his hands. Remember, no internet back then, no basketball on TV in this country, that's for sure. Nurse used to order VHS tapes from a website in Germany called Pontel.com. You'd have to order only one team from this website. Nurse selected, of course, it's the mid-90s, the Chicago Bulls. He wanted to study the triangle offense, and that's the offense he implemented with his teams over here. So if you ever see the triangle still run in the BBL today, you can point to Nick Nurse for that as well. Nurse sculpted a lot of his coaching philosophies in this country back when he was here. Phil Handy, who I mentioned, the Raptors assistant, who won a championship with Nick Nurse as his head coach in Manchester in the early 2000s. He still has the t-shirt to this day that Nurse handed to him. Phil Handy used to have a slogan. When he hit a free throw or a three-pointer on the road, he used to quiet the crowd. A lot of people do that. Nurse had a t-shirt printed specifically for Handy with that slogan on it, and Handy has it somewhere in his wardrobe in Canada. How incredible is that? And whether it was Ronnie Baker or anyone else, a lot of his players say that Nurse was fantastic at pushing them. Because Nick Nurse came here as a player coach and eventually was just a coach, he was still young. So in practices, if they were running wind sprints or taking shooting competitions, Nurse would try and win them all. He wanted to set an example, and the pound coin was his best friend. He used to put pound coins down in the middle of the court, and the best shooter or the winner of that competition would take home the pot. And a lot of his players say that Nurse was one of the best shooters and would inevitably win them. He'd have to hit a half-court shot before he left the practice room, and he had a fine system, one of the few fine systems in history that was actually positive for the people that turned up late. Because if you turned up late, for every minute you were late, you had to pay £1. At the end of the month though, Nurse would pull all the fine money and take his team out for dinner. I wonder what he does in Toronto. I have seen that in the pre-season with the Raptors this year, he did hand out wrestling-style championship belts for competition winners. So those are the sorts of things that were inspired by this former great pole vaulter. As if this story couldn't get any more bizarre, especially for British basketball fans who follow the NBA closely. Back in 1997, Nurse was coaching the Birmingham Bullets. His team was going up against, you guessed it, Derby. And guess who suited up for that team? Current Raptors GM, Masai Ujiri. Of course, for Nick Nurse, it all seems to make sense. What do you think of Mr. Nurse? Do you have any more stories that I haven't mentioned? Any stats, any figures, any factoids from even this season or his time in the UK? Were you a fan of the Derby Bucks back in the early 90s? Did you see Nick Nurse play or coach in this country? Drop the comments below. Tweet me at Max_Whittle. Follow the NBA until June when the NBA finals hit. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to the channel already, please do. Till next Tuesday.